Hello everyone. This is the third and final video lecture of this week, week 9, and this final lecture is about everyday sexuality in Babylonia, the Terracotta Plaques. In the first two lectures, we kind of really looked at north. We're actually sailing back down to south again, and looking at something that is very predominantly important in the South. What I hope to present in this video lecture is a body of a sort of really very focused assemblage of artifacts from the South, objects, works of art, you name it, that seems to be the hallmark of this time period. A form of popular art, if you would like to call it that, we know from this Old Babylonian period, in particular found in abundance in the residential neighborhoods of various southern Mesopotamian cities. As Zainab Bahrani discusses these in her chapter that we're reading this week, this was a tremendous group of artifacts, the production of mold-made terracotta plaques and figurines, particularly, that developed in this time period in the South, which were mainly made for domestic and personal use, really, rather than being dedicated to a temple or made as artworks for the palace or something like that. These are really found in individual houses and found in mass-produced and in abundance. Clay is very abundant in Mesopotamia. It's a very easy to find material, and it is associated with soil, which is really basic material from which life was created, as it was believed to have been created by the Mesopotamians. So it has both symbolic importance, but it's also kind of really abundant availability. What happens fascinatingly in the early second millennium BCE first is really this kind of invention of mass reproducibility of images and artifacts, and here I'm showing you some of these kind of mold-made clay figurines that were excavated in the city of Susa, each of them holding their breasts with elaborate hairstyles, hairdos, prominently displayed jewelry, diadems, earrings, chokers, pendants, and very much articulated pubic hair as well. They're about 17 centimeters high. It's about 7 inches tall. Very conventionally speaking, these figurines and terracotta plaques were actually usually interpreted as fertility figures. And some scholars even went ahead to suggest the possibility of cultic or temple prostitution, because it has to be somehow ritual and it has to do with sexuality. So what do you expect, And so, but actually, interestingly, we really don't have much evidence for that. But more recently, the younger generation of scholars, critical scholarship, who's more in tune with feminist scholarship, then and considered a new interpretation of these figurines. And so considering their frontal pose, for example, the representation of different kinds of body parts, their provocative gestures, their adorned bodies, then suggest this kind of fertility or prostitution. It's really not very satisfactory. That this interpretation actually finds a really good match in the written literature, particularly poetry, from this time period. And there's an abundance of poetry being produced around this time that suggests an interpretation that gets close to this concept of kuzbu, in Akkadian, which means sexual allure as divine power or divine charm, or sexual allure that is given to you, to a woman's body, as a form of power given by gods. And so this concept is really actually quite intriguing for us to think about. In fact, this kind of representation goes back to the late 3rd millennium. It's not entirely new. We have some handmade examples, particularly handmade examples from the Ur-3 period, like these figurines that I'm showing you from the Oriental Institute. One day when the Oriental Institute opens, hopefully in the coming months, you can visit and see these figurines there. They're pretty cute, but they have I want to kind of really point out their really elaborate pubic hair that's kind of really delineated over there. And so actually so what's really quite interesting is that these figurines and terracotta plaques of sexual allure of Kuzbu really goes well with some of the poetry that we have from this time period. For example, this court poem, I'm showing you a court poem in Sumerian from the late 3rd millennium BCE, from the court of Shusin, one of the last rulers of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. And so it reads, my God, the Taran keeper, her beer is sweet, and her vulva is sweet like her beer, and her beer is sweet, and her vulva is sweet like all her mouths, and her beer is sweet. Her cuspar beer and her regular beer are sweet. And so you see this kind of eroticism and kind of this kind of power that sort of emanates both from the images themselves, but also this poem expressed perhaps aligns with this kind of what the images are in a way talking about. The reason, the actual important reason why we have such a good record of this time, from this time period, is the fact that archaeologists were interested in this kind of early 20th century at least to excavate some large neighborhoods. And so one interesting exposure, one interesting sort of excavation we have is from the city of Ur, an entire neighborhood, an entire residential neighborhood was excavated by Leonard Woolley, who was very much super interested in kind of really every little detail of this, and this dated from the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. An entire sort of urban neighborhood with tiny houses kind of really clustered up against each other, little alleyways, shrines, little street squares, shops, there's a little bakery, there's a little shrine, and so on. And so here we see him excavate actually the cult image in one of the small neighborhood shrines. All this is to say that when he excavated this neighborhood, a lot of these houses actually revealed these kinds of terracotta figurines and terracotta plaques. And I'm showing you a baked clay mold for a nude female figure, again depicted frontally here, with hands at breasts and a horned crown, and she has wings or cloak and talon feet. And this is from the British Museum. It's about 12 centimeters high. So I'm showing you just as a kind of to show how these figurines, these terracotta plaques were mass-produced. They were mass-produced using these kinds of molds, and you can produce hundreds of clay figurines using this kind of a mold. Here I'm showing you perhaps the best known examples of such representations. This is a very, very special example of them. And this is known as the Burney relief from the Old Babylonian period, a large-scale terracotta plaque made in the tradition of these kind of small votive figurines, plaques that are commonly found extensively in Mesopotamia during the Middle Bronze Age. These were ubiquitous kind of devotional objects, either represented or to the temples or kept at home for protective, apotropaic, or religious reasons. So why do you have them in the house? You want to think about that. A number of protective and healing and all kinds of purposes we can think about that. The frontally depicted nude goddess is a popular theme in the Middle East at this time, especially in northern Syria, in the Levant, but also in Mesopotamia. So this is a relatively large-sized terracotta plaque made of straw-tempered clay pressed into a mold. Although her specific identity remains a little bit of a mystery, some scholars identify her with Ereshkigal, perhaps the queen of the great earth, the goddess of underworld, because she has wings pointing downward to the ground. She has bird of prey talons and a horned crown. The horned crown tells us that she is a goddess. Her pose reveals her sexual allure to us, reminding us this concept of Kuzbu in Akkadian, a form of bodily power. She's standing on two lions. You want to really notice that who are sitting back to back, and she's flanked symmetrically by two owls. I mean, look at how strange this whole situation is. And these owls are looking straight at the viewer very intensely. The reference to the underworld is kind of clear here because of the owls as well. And then what's really interesting is that she's holding these sort of the rod and the ring. You will remember from the Palace of Mari that we talked about in the second lecture, where Ishtar was handing over the rod and the ring as a insignia of kingship, of being just king, to Zimrilim, and announcing him as the king of Mari. And so having this kind of rod and the ring in the hands of this Burney relief woman also somehow, I think, connects her with kingship somehow. It's really not clear how, but it's really quite fascinating. So another concept that I'd like to introduce to you that is related to the concept of Kuzbu, kind of a really broader concept of divine power, is May. And I'd like to, this is very important and really interesting for me to talk about May as this kind of Sumerian May as defined as divine ordinances or decrees, sometimes defined as a thing's divinely ordained essence, what a thing should be. So this is actually a kind of a divine power that's given, intrinsic powers of characteristics of divine beings that make the essential activities within the social world function properly. So mays are powers that are given by gods or goddesses to humans, kings, cities, societies, and then when you have the may, then this kind of world operates well. You know, the rituals work really well, and so on. So May what is really fascinating is that when you actually receive May from the gods, then this presence of May in you, in your city, in your society, in your temple, or in an artifact, even, you know, sometimes like a chariot would have May. That means that it shines through it. It's like it becomes iridescent. And so this is an important aspect of May, that the objects, spaces, and bodies that are touched or infused by such supernatural agencies then become visually powerful as well. So May then is not a representational or spiritual entity, but it's not a symbol either. It's not a symbol. But it's an ontological, it's a physical entity, a material quality that's given to kings. The king may have May, and this May would show in his body. A city may have May, it will show in its architecture. Or a chariot may have May, and it will show in its materials and craftsmanship. And it will shine, right, with iridescence. So then this is important for us to understand sexual allure. Then Kuzbu then is one of these Mays, and this kind of frontal female nudity can be considered as this kind of May of the body shining through, being iridescent, being very powerful, captivating, impacting others. So I want to wrap up my lecture then by showing you a set of more everyday terracotta plaques. So not all of those plaques are essentially kind of really sexually explicit, but or erotic, but some of them are religious, some of them are magical, like this mythical figure. A nude mythical figure that is depicted over here, again with the sort of vessel where water comes out of that vessel, and he's facing us, so that has some interesting aspects. Sometimes we have intimate scenes between couples, like this one that was excavated by Woolley at Ur at the Diktika Mound. Or this very unusual one showing a woman drinking from a jar, resting on the ground while being penetrated by a nude male in the back. We also have several bed scenes, actually. So we see either a couple making love, a nude woman sort of lying on the bed. These are all terracotta clay plaques, or simply a bed with a pubic triangle on it. So the pubic triangle sort of really is just like, you know, the woman is really reduced to the pubic triangle there. That's actually the cuneiform sign for woman, Sol sign, that is kind of really abstracted into the bed. So there are also another interesting set with a woman and a phallus as an object of pleasure. So I would like to then actually the Burney relief, to go back to the Burney relief, then is this kind of, now you understand the context of the Burney relief, but then the Burney relief also brings not only this kind of idea of Kuzbu, the terracotta plaques, but also depicts this time a goddess, the goddess of the underworld, and holding insignia of kingship. This insignia of kingship also appears, and this is really, I'd like to wrap up my lecture by talking about this law stele of Hammurabi from the first dynasty of Babylon. And we see the rod and the ring being represented here as a form of sort of the god Shamash in this top scene, handing the rod and the ring to Hammurabi. And so this is how we know, and this is the scene, a very similar scene that we saw in the wall painting in Mari when Ishtar was handing rod and the ring to Zimrilim, the king of Mari. So this intriguing monument is dedicated. It has, as you can see, it has a very long inscription, and this entire stele is dedicated to law, justice, and maintenance of social order. Then Hammurabi became actually very much of a celebrity of his own accord. Hammurabi was the king of a small regional state at Babylon at this time, a small kingdom that was forming in the 19th century BCE. With Babylon as its new capital city. We'll talk about Babylon in the coming weeks again as well. And this stele is really quite interesting because it's very important in terms of language, in terms of standardization of the Babylonian dialect of Akkadian that actually became very much standardized and being accessible to people. So we're thinking about increasing literacy with this. So if we look at the laws, we get a really good glimpse of the Babylonian society here. So all of the laws that Hammurabi has actually introduced are listed on the stele in the form of this kind of calligraphic inscription. So it is not only communicating these laws on the stele, but it is also portraying Hammurabi as a just king who really recognizes the rule of law and applies that. And so if we look at some of the examples of the laws that are listed on the stele, I think you would be very interested. I wanted to read this section to you. I selected a section that's really about architects and about building a house for someone. Because I studied architecture, I'm interested in this section of the law code of Hammurabi. So he says, for example, if a builder builds a house for someone, and this someone is the word for a person is actually a legal person, avilum, and completes it, he shall give him a fee of 2 shekels in money for each sar of surface. So there is actually setting a standard here. If a builder builds a house for someone, an avilum, and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built fall in and kill its owner, that builder shall be put to death. So it's not easy to be an architect in this time period. So if you build a crappy building and it falls down on its owner, bad luck. Really, really, really bad consequences for the architect. If it kills the son of the owner, the son Dumu or Mushkenum of that builder shall be put to death. So that's also pretty harsh, right? And so Mushkenum is important because it refers to the members of the household. Avilum is the legal male landowner person, a kind of a legal person that they're talking about. And then there's the Mushkenum, and then there's slave, which is a vardum. So if it kills a slave, vardum, of the owner, he shall pay slave for slave to the owner of the house, and so on. So there's this really quite interesting set of laws that regulate the operation of, what the architectural practice will look like in the society. And so so in this video, we kind of really I tried to present to you a really coherent body of artifacts, particularly from the Old Babylonian period, in southern Mesopotamia that became really the hallmark of sort of everyday sexuality. But then we completed our journey with a little excursion to Babylon to talk about the famous law stele of Hammurabi, which presents the king as a just king by listing his laws, but also depicting him receiving the insignia of kingship from Shamash. And the rod and the ring, those signs of justness in kingship, connects it to the Burney relief, which is the terracotta plaque that then, in a way, hijacks that kind of really kingship iconography as well. So this completes my third lecture and all of the lectures of this week. And thank you for listening. I look forward to our discussion on Thursday.